relegated ourselves to, but you've talked in the past about how things are embedded in previous calls that I kind of want to put together, because a lot of the topics that are unique to what your concerns are actually morphed into one. And let me kind of explain how those are kind of morphed. First of all, let's go back to Common Core. No matter what they say, I will argue every single time that Common Core is the attempt to have nationalized standards, curriculum, and teacher training controlled through federal bureaucracy, which forces traditional academic education to be dumped towards behavioral conditioning. Because you read Common Core, a lot of it has embedded social-emotional learning. So it's bad enough that it's weak academically. It also embeds social-emotional learning, and that's very key. And no one's talking about that. Everyone's talking about the academics. I would argue very that the process standards is the first step to social-emotional learning. And let me discuss with you a conversation I had with a member of the state board, Patricia Hardy, or Pat Hardy, as commonly called. I was on the state board when the math standards, which talked about earlier, were approved. I can show you my copy of the standards. Nowhere in those standards was the term process standards. It doesn't exist. And I've got the actual copy of the original of those standards. Somewhere between the time we approved it and the time it became the standard, someone, and to this day, I don't know who that someone is, added process standards. During the meeting I had with Pat Hardy, I think it was in 2015 in Austin.
Okay.
We're talking about process standards, and I said process standards should not be there. And Pat replied to me, and it's actually in the archives. She said, Charlie, it's in every course, and you know this, and you should know this. And I was just, because at that point, I was no longer on the board, so I could not address her as a colleague, but rather I had to address her as a member of the state board, where I was just a regular person concerned about an issue. So I didn't have the same wherewithal to speak back to her and say, no, you're wrong on that issue. Now,
that is really interesting.
It goes further. Ready? Mm-hmm. What's happening now, and again, you discussed this, is under this new umbrella of education under ESA, again, it now asks that we now collect national data systems, which you've talked about previously, where we collect personal identifiable information on our families, our children, creating value, attitude, and dossiers, basically, which will serve as mental psychometers of sorts. They will be used for who knows what purpose. And let me give you an example. Last year, when we administered the STAR test, TEA directed us, I'm going to say it again, TEA directed educators that if a child went to the bathroom, they must sign on a sheet of paper saying Johnny Jones went to the bathroom and was there for 5 minutes. And then they signed their name saying Johnny Jones was in the bathroom for 5 minutes, and then it was countersigned by a teacher who was outside the bathroom ensuring that Johnny did what Johnny was told he would, or what Johnny said he was doing. And when this was over, I was just beside myself going, are you kidding me? Who's going to read this data? Who is going to amend this data and say, you know what, we've got 1 million Johnnies in the state of Texas, not that we do, and how are they going to use that information and for what purpose? So that evening, I called my good friend, Ken Mercer, who's on the state board, and I said, Ken, are you aware of this? And he said, I've never heard of that, Charlie. And I said, Ken, I swear to you, this happened. And he said, let me find out. Well, when we did the second administration of STAR, that was no longer a criteria. So I want to, first of all, thank Ken Mercer for having done what needed to be done to at least take one step out of this process, because that, to me, goes beyond ridiculous.
Right.
I mean, so Johnny goes to the bathroom. You know, that happens to the best of us. And I think it's a natural process that we do. We go to the bathroom every once in a while.
You know, that's one of the issues that no one is discussing, it seems, whether it's in the Texas legislature, whether it's in any legislature at the state level or at the national level. They are talking, they've had hearings on it, but I haven't heard it mentioned at the state level that the amount of data, personally identifiable data, on individual students, teachers, and families is so that is so wrong. And it's like these legislators think it's okay. Even listening to the Next Generation of Assessments and Accountability Commission, it was all about collecting data and how this data can be used. And because we know that Obama changed the regulation on the FERPA law to where this data can be collected without parental consent, and then these third-party technology companies have access to this data, my problem with all of this is that I do not send my children to school, to the public school, to the private school, to a charter school, to any school. I send them there to learn to read and write and do math and know history so they have an education of opportunity, equal opportunity. I do not send them there to be guinea pigs for technology companies to create curriculum management systems or curriculum using my children's behavioral data for the profit of these technology companies. And in my mind, that's what's happening. Am I off base on that?
Well, no, you're not. But again, keep one thing in mind. This, in my view, was magnified when President Obama signed Executive Order 12866. And 12866 is basically talking about where they changed FERPA. And FERPA stands for the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. And with his executive order, children's data could be shared freely with businesses to validate curriculum, software, phone apps, textbooks. I'm sorry, we don't have textbooks. Instructional materials. Okay, I got to get the right language here.
Right.
And I apologize for misleading you on textbooks. Such that everything is whack. And let's go a step further. We now know most recently, and again, kind of off topic, but still the same thing, that SAT and the ACT are now aligned to Common Core, which means since we're applying our TEKS even with the process standards that Pat Hardy spoke of, in effect, what we're doing is we're putting our children at a disadvantage because they can't compete with those kids who are aligned to the Common Core. So now, if one of our children wants to go to an Ivy League school or something like that, I'm not sure why they'd want to, but if they want to, they can't compete on the same plane because they're not being taught the same materials because now we're on two different planes. And that became true with U.S. history with APUSH, for example, where things are just out of control. Now, under that same executive order, what in effect happened was President Obama created a state longitudinal data system in which every state will use the same data elements to collect private sensitive information on attitudes, values, beliefs, on individual children and their families. So, in effect, all of this is almost, for lack of a better word, almost incestuous in a very bad way.
Well, and the fact that during the Next Generation of Assessment and Accountability Commission meeting, Texas Commissioner Mike Morath recommended that Texas follow other states in putting in place formalized Texas TEKS, Texas standards, for non-cognitive soft skills. He used that term, and he said the term social and emotional learning. So if Texas, as you've already made us aware, we've already been implementing these behavioral, they haven't been formalized standards, but we've been implementing them. If they are put in as Texas standards, if you've got them in standards, you've got to assess the teachers and assess the students on whether the teachers are being successful at basically controlling the behaviors of students.
Well, I would argue that it's much worse than that. I would argue that by virtue of the fact that teachers now have to address the social emotional learning, which can be anything from family circumstance to socioeconomic status to family violence, then in effect you've now made teachers psychologists,
right,
of which few, if any, are trained to do. So what if I, teacher A, don't read a sign, don't see a signal, quote unquote, of what the child is exhibiting? Is now my livelihood at risk because I didn't know when I wasn't properly trained in the first place? Where is that proverbial line drawn as to what I'm responsible for, not responsible for, and what if something were to happen that would lead to risky behavior by the student? Because, again, under social emotional learning, it's supposed to drop bullying. It's supposed to drop risky behavior, drug use, everything else. But if you notice, only one study exists that says that's true, and that's by the people who invented the program. Oh, for goodness sakes. That's kind of like asking the tobacco company, do you think cigarettes cause cancer? Well, not at all. Not at all. They don't, I mean, that's ridiculous. And then if we're incentivizing children to do what should be the right thing, that to me would be the equivalent of a police officer saying, you know, you were speeding, but you know what? Instead of giving you a speeding ticket, I'm going to give you a free out of jail card so that you won't do it again. Are you kidding me? What's happened to these children when they meet the real world? And they understand that not everything in life is incentivized. There's got to be some intrinsic motivation that leads you from point A to point B. And it kind of, well, now I'll go further than that. It does hurt students who are intrinsically motivated. I gave an example to students here recently where I said, Susie works real hard and gets 100 because she's always studying and trying to do her best. But poor little Johnny, he wants to go play football. And for goodness sakes, football takes priority over academics, and when Johnny took his test, he got a 40. So tell you what I'm going to do, Susie. I'm going to take 30 of your points because you don't need 100. All you got to do is pass. And I'm going to give those 30 points to Johnny because he was playing football. Now both of you have a 70. And they were like, what? I said, isn't this where we're headed to in our government?
Yeah.
Where no one's accountable? Where everyone is now equal on an equal plane? And she said, no, Mr. Garza, I earned that 100. I said, well, what about Johnny? And I kid you not, Alice said, what about Johnny? With a tone like that.
That's right. That's right.
Tell Johnny to study. Just like I did.
Yes, exactly. That's what we're taking away from our children. And that's, it's just so frustrating. I want to bring in, I'm totally